Welcome back. Week 3, Day 2. Work and Economy. Gender pay gap, gender ceiling, unpaid labor. The organization of work and the broader economy is deeply gendered, producing systematic inequalities in wages, occupational mobility, and the recognition of unpaid labor. This unpaid labor that sustains markets and states. These patterns persist across countries despite legal commitments to equality, reflecting the interaction of gender norms, institutional arrangements, and global economic restructuring. Now, let's look at conceptual frameworks. Feminist economists argue that mainstream economics is built around a narrow focus on market production that marginalizes social reproduction, care, and household labor, which are disproportionately performed by women. This leads to underestimation of women's contributions to national income and to misspecified policy responses that treat women either as secondary earners or as elastic reserve of labor. Intersectional gender analysis further emphasizes that class, caste, race, ethnicity, and migration status mediate women's location in labor markets, shaping who is concentrated in informal, low-paid, precarious work and who can access professional or managerial positions. The gender pay gap, glass ceiling, and unequal unpaid labor are therefore not isolated phenomena but interlocking mechanisms of stratification within capitalist and patriarchal systems. Gender pay gap. The gender pay gap usually refers to the difference in average earnings between women and men, often measured as a percentage difference in gross hourly wages of full-time employees. Globally, women are estimated to earn about 20% less than men on average, even though women's educational attainment has increased and in some contexts surpasses that of men. Recent comparative data indicate that in OECD countries, the median full-time working women earns roughly 11% less than the median full-time working man, which translates into women receiving about 89 units of currency for every 100 earned by men in similar conditions. Earlier, global estimates from trade union and multilateral sources suggested even wider gaps on the order of 23%, with very slow convergence and projections that equal pay might not be reached until several decades in the future if trends do not accelerate. Feminist scholarship distinguishes between unadjusted and adjusted wage gaps, noting that unadjusted gaps reflect both direct discrimination and structural segregation by sector, occupation, and working hours, while adjusted gaps attempt to control for characteristics such as education, age, and experience. Even after controlling for these variables, a residual gap generally remains, which is interpreted as a combined effect of discrimination, norms, and unmeasured constraints on women's labor market behavior. Explanations for the pay gap include horizontal segregation, where women are overrepresented in lower paid sectors such as care, education, and certain service industries, and vertical segregation where women are clustered in lower ranks within organizations with limited progression to top positions. Motherhood penalties and marriage related norms can lead to interrupted careers, part time work, and reduced access to training, all of which depress women's earnings relative to men's over the life course. Economic globalization has had ambiguous effects on gender wage differentials, sometimes narrowing gaps in low skill occupations where female intensive export sectors expand, and sometimes reinforcing inequalities through informalization and race to the bottom labor regimes that rely heavily on women's cheap labor. Meanwhile, macro-level analysis show that gender pay gaps coexist with large gaps in labor force participation, suggesting that narrower wage gaps in some middle-income countries may reflect the selective employment of relatively privileged women rather than genuine equality. Glass ceiling and occupational mobility. The term glass ceiling describes invisible institutional and cultural barriers that prevent women and other marginalized groups from advancing to senior decision-making positions despite formal equality of opportunity. These barriers operate in both public and private sector organizations and are typically not written into policy but embedded in everyday practices, expectations of leadership, and informal networks that favor dominant groups. Empirical research shows that women remain underrepresented in higher paying managerial and executive roles, and when they do reach such positions, continue to earn less than male counterparts, even with comparable qualifications and experiences. Quantitative analysis attribute roughly 60% of gender wage gaps in high-income countries to glass ceiling effects linked to motherhood penalties and constrained career progression, while the remaining 40% is related to sticky floors arising from persistent discrimination and stereotyping at lower levels of hierarchy. The glass ceiling manifests in multiple ways, including women being passed over for promotion, being excluded from informal mentoring and networking spaces, experiencing microaggressions, and facing doubts about their competence or commitment if they have care responsibilities. Studies on women managers report that perceived glass ceiling barriers are even associated with higher work-family conflict, reduced job satisfaction, and poorer mental health outcomes, illustrating the psychological cause of institutionalized gender bias. Feminist organizational analysis argue that dominant models of ideal worker assume uninterrupted full-time availability and geographic mobility, which align more easily with male life courses in contexts where women shoulder the bulk of care work. Without structural changes in working time norms, parental leave policies, and the valuation of care, individual women's merit or ambition cannot by itself dismantle the glass ceiling and diversify initiatives that focus solely on mentoring or confidence building risk, blaming women for structural constraints. Unpaid labor and social reproduction. Unpaid domestic and care work is central to sustaining households, communities, and the labor force, yet it remains largely invisible in conventional national accounting and labor market statistics. Time use surveys across regions consistently show that women perform about 3 times more unpaid care work than men, encompassing childcare, cooking, cleaning, elder care, and support for persons with illness or disability. Recent global estimates indicate that unpaid care responsibilities keep approximately 708 million women outside the labor force, compared with about 40 million men, meaning that care is the primary reason for non-participation for nearly half of working age women, but only a small fraction of men. More broadly, around 1.6 billion women and 800 million men are outside the labor force, with 45% of these women and 5% of these men attributing their non-participation to care duties, showing the scale of gendered constraints linked to unpaid work. The unequal division of unpaid labor constitutes what feminist theorists term the care economy or social production, which includes biological reproduction of people, the daily and generational reproduction of labor power, and the maintenance of social bonds and communities. Because this work is unpaid and often socially coded as women's natural role, it is chronically undervalued. Yet, estimates suggest that if unpaid care were assigned a monetary value based on replacement or opportunity cost methods, it would represent a substantial share of global GDP. Unpaid labor is closely intertwined with formal labor markets. Women with heavy care responsibilities are more likely to accept part-time, informal, or precarious employment with limited social protection, reinforcing patterns of economic vulnerability and dependence. In lower income and rural contexts, inadequate public infrastructure, limited access to water, energy, health services, transport, and the absence of affordable child care intensify the time burden of unpaid work on women and girls, restricting schooling, skill acquisition, and livelihood opportunities. A growing body of policy research identified unpaid care work as the missing link in explanations of gender gaps in labor force participation, wages, and job quality, arguing that without redistributing care and recognizing its economic value, other gender equality interventions will have limited impact. Recommended strategies include investing in universal high-quality child care and elderly care services, expanding social protection to include carers, promoting men's participation in unpaid work through leave policies and norm change, and systematically integrating time use data into economic planning. Interconnections and policy responses. The gender pay gap, glass ceiling, and unequal unpaid labor reinforce one another as part of a cumulative disadvantage process over the life course. Lower starting wages, interruptions for care, limited promotion opportunities, and concentration of feminized sectors leading to substantial lifetime earning gaps, which in turn produce gender differences in savings, asset ownership, and pensions in older age. At a macro level, international organizations argue that reducing gender gaps in labor participation, pay, and leadership would generate significant gains in productivity, tax revenues, and inclusive growth, making gender equality in work not only a matter of justice but also of developmental strategy. The Global Gender Gap Index reports that while progress has been made in educational attainment and health, gaps remain wide in economic participation and opportunity, and at the current pace, full parity would still take many decades to achieve. Policy response to the gender pay gap includes pay transparency measures, mandatory gender pay gap reporting, enforcing of equal pay for work of equal value, and the use of job evaluation tools that correct for the historical undervaluation of feminized occupations. Complementary measures seek to disintegrate occupations by encouraging women and girls into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as well as improving wages and working conditions in care and service sectors where women already predominate. To address the glass ceiling, organizations and states have experimented with gender quotas for corporate boards and political bodies, targets for women in leadership, bias training, flexible working arrangements, and strengthened protections against harassment and discrimination. Evidence suggests that purely voluntary initiatives have limited effects unless accompanied by accountability mechanisms, and that measures that normalize men's update of parental leave and flexible work are crucial for breaking the link between femininity, care, and reduced commitment to paid work. Recognizing unpaid labor requires both statistical and substantive reforms, including regular time use surveys, satellite accounts of household production, integration of care indicators into social and economic policy frameworks. Public investment in care infrastructure, from child care centers to community health centers, can simultaneously create decent jobs, reduce women's unpaid workload, and improve human development outcomes, illustrating that care-sensitive macroeconomic policy can advance gender equality while strengthening social cohesion. Now coming to our case study. Work and economy in the context of unpaid care and labor force participation. A recent set of estimates released around the International Day of Care and Support illustrates how unpaid labor shapes women's economic participation at a global level. In 2023, approximately 748 million people aged between 15 or older were outside the global labor force due to care responsibilities, representing about one-third of all working age individuals who were not engaged in paid work or actively seeking employment. Of this group, 708 million were women, while only about 40 million were men, indicating that women account for roughly 95% of those excluded from the labor market because of unpaid care duties. When compared to overall participation figures of 1.6 billion women and 800 million men worldwide, these data show that care responsibilities are cited as the main reason for non-participation by 45% of women, but just 4% of men, revealing a stark gender asymmetry in the constraints posed by unpaid labor. The figures highlight that the burden of unpaid care is not evenly distributed among women. Those with lower levels of education and those living in rural areas experience particularly high barriers to labor market entry due to a combination of inadequate infrastructure, limited formal employment opportunities, and entrenched gender norms that position women as primary carers. In such context, basic tasks such as collecting water or fuel can consume several hours per day, further limiting time for schooling, skill development, or income generating activities, and deepening cycles of poverty and dependence. The International Labour Agency, responsible for these estimates, emphasizes that addressing these disparities requires coordinated public action rather than relying on private household adjustments. Recommended measures include expanding social protection for carers, investing in child care, elder care, and disability support services, improving rural infrastructure, and implementing policies that encourage a more equitable division of care responsibilities between women and men, such as parental leave for fathers and flexible work arrangements that are not penalized in promotion decisions. This case illustrates the intimate link between unpaid labor and broader pattern of economic inequality, demonstrating that gender gaps in employment and pay cannot be fully understood without analyzing how care responsibilities are socially allocated and institutionally supported or even neglected. It also underscores that transforming the gendered organization of work and economy demands a dual focus on redistributing unpaid care within households and between households and the state, alongside integrative strategies targeting wage gaps and glass ceiling barriers in formal labor markets. Thank you.